van de Leidse islamoloog
Islam and the values of the modern age. Can they stimulate each other? Living in an age of rapid change and even turmoil. Worldwide, a revival of Islam can be observed with many social, religious, and political aspects. Many changes are coming about rapidly in traditional family structures and in all kinds of interpretations of Islam.
Assalamu alaikum. Welkom bij de Nederlandse Moslimomroep. Ter afsluiting van onze serie Islam en Moderniteit kunt u nu kijken naar het eerste deel van De toekomst van de islam. De presentatie van dit driedelig programma is in handen van de Leidse islamoloog Sjoerd van Koningsveld.
Islam and the values of the modern age. Can they stimulate each other, notwithstanding obvious conflict? We are living in an age of rapid change and even turmoil. Worldwide, a revival of Islam can be observed with many social, religious, and political aspects. Many changes are coming about rapidly in traditional family structures and in all kinds of interpretations of Islam. How will Islam enter the 21st century? What is the future of Islam? We have invited today 4 prominent Muslim scholars of different backgrounds who will share with us their views on these subjects and other related items. I should like to welcome, first of all, Professor Mehmed Iden, Dean of the Faculty of Theology of the University in Izmir, who is a specialist in religious philosophy and ethics, and wrote a number of books and many articles in these fields, especially in Turkish and in English as well. Secondly, Professor Rifat Hassan, of Pakistani background, who is a professor of religious studies in the University of Louisville, Kentucky, in the United States of America. Professor Hassan is a renowned specialist in the field of the studies of the position of women in Islam and of interreligious dialogue. She authored a number of books and articles in these fields. Thirdly, Professor Ali Kettani from Rabat, Morocco, who is the rector of Ibn Rushd University in Córdoba, Spain. Professor Kettani is worldwide known as the author of many books in Arabic and in English as well, on the position of Muslim minorities, especially in the Western world. And last but not least, Professor Hassan Hanafi, head of the Department of Philosophy of the University of Cairo, who is a specialist in philosophy and in Islamic philosophy, and who has authored a series of books in this field, especially on the relation of Islam and renewal, mainly in Arabic, but also in other languages. Professor Hanafi, we are witnessing today many political movements inspired by Islam. This is a big issue worldwide. Are we dealing here with an accidental phenomenon of which we may assume that it will disappear in the coming years? Or is there a deeper meaning to this movement which will eventually perhaps change the religious life of Islam?
I think what we are seeing now is only the top of the iceberg. That means Islamic movement nowadays is something essential to history. Just to remind you, we are now living in the beginning of the 15th century Hijra date.
Yes.
We have our first glorious classical culture in the 700 years, and Ibn Khaldun rightly came to make the history. And we lived other 700s post Ibn Khaldun under the Ottoman Empire, where we have memorized the past without creating. And now, these young people think that Islam is seeing a third moment in history where the golden age of the 700 years will come again. Then here really we are on the crossroads of history. Secondly, maybe we have our big reformist movement since last century. Afghani conceived Islam as anti-colonial from outside and anti-oppression from inside. But the movement died out. And all our nationalistic movements came outside of our reformist movements. But when the Arab revolutions came, they ruled alone without the Islamic trend. They went underground. And after the crisis of the nation state nowadays, then they are coming again to take the revenge and saying, you kicked us out of the rule and now we are coming again.
Okay, this is clear, but Professor Hassan, can such a movement inspired by Islam, can it find a compromise with other movements of a more modernist orientation which exist also in the Muslim world? Is a compromise between liberal and modernist ideas possible in your mind?
Let me respond first by saying that from a certain point of view, the greatest challenge that is being confronted by Muslims, contemporary Muslims, is the challenge of modernity. And Muslims in general tend to see modernity in two different ways. They see it, as modernization, which they equate with science and technology and better standard of life and so on, and regard it very positively, and I don't know any Muslim who doesn't want it. The other aspect of modernity, however, is seen as what is called westernization, which is identified with mass Western culture, which is everything from latchkey kids to community breakup, family breakup, pornography, and so on, which is very largely disapproved in Muslim cultures. So when I'm asked questions about modernity, I distinguish between these two things. That Muslims as a whole, because of their history, because more particularly the history of being colonized by the West, there is a certain amount of reaction that is inevitable to westernization, and the onslaught of Western imperialism, even which is continuing in many ways, is an important factor. But that as far as if you understand modernity in the sense of modernization, I don't think that the Muslims anywhere are against it. So that there, when you talk about a compromise, I don't think that there is a basic conflict as such between Muslim consciousness, contemporary Muslim consciousness, and modernity, parts of modernity.
Would you agree with this, Professor Kettani, and also taking into account perhaps the contemporary development in countries in North Africa, if possible?
Well, really, I would like to point out to some misconceptions about Islam, maybe in Muslim countries as well as in the West. First of all, talking about the Islamic revival as a new phenomenon is really wrong, because after all, Islam as a whole is not a religion in the European sense of the word. It's a deen. That means it's a way of life, etc. And therefore, the political part has always been very important in the good sense of the word. In other words, Islam has always been in Muslim societies a driving force to remove injustice, to fight for the rights of the people, whether internal injustice or external injustice, and so forth and so on. Islam as a ide force has been eclipsed in the Muslim world for one generation or more, because Islam has been the driving force in the independence movements. And then the nationalist ideologies, leftist ideologies, etc., for the masses, at least for their point of view, have failed. And it was only normal that the people return to the ide force that always liberated them, that was Islam. But there are two characteristics that are very specific for this for this new phase of Islamic revival. One is that Islam now is really supported by the young. Is really the young generation against the older generation that is less Islamic, really. This is very interesting. That means Islam is with us to stay, because they are the young that are carrying the flag. The second thing is that really Islam is becoming more than a needy force that is universal than something that has to do with Muslim states, quote unquote. And therefore, it's a needy force that interests Muslim and non-Muslim as well. There are also some misconceptions about Muslim movement in Islam that thinking that is something strange and different. After all, Islam is not really inherently anti-West. It's ridiculous to think it that way. Or anti-modernism. On the contrary. Islam has always been a force for the justice of the people, for the right of the people. And I can see perfectly the day where all the, I would say, progressist forces, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, getting together to fight against injustice in the world.
Yes,
this is how I look at it.
I understand you perfectly, but these Islamist movements, they conceive of a certain type of state, which they call an Islamic state or an Islamic government, and many discussions are going on nowadays, as you perhaps know, about the rights which will be respected in such a state, and especially with reference to all kinds of minorities. And I'm not talking only or firstly about non-Muslim minorities, I'm talking about Muslim minorities in comparison with Muslim majorities. For example, in Turkey, the Alawites. Will a Muslim state, or will the state as it is conceived by these movements, will such a state, and is it possible that such an Islamic state will respect and grant equal rights to different kinds of confessional Muslim groups, Professor Iden?
But before I answer your question, I have to be sure about your term Islamic State, because Islamic State is an ambiguous term. I mean, Islamic,
that's for sure.
Islamic
Yes.
State, Muslim state, and you have a Muslim country and some type of state. There
Yes.
are different states and within the same Muslim country. So I think Islamic State is a very difficult term to define, really. If you mean by Islamic State as a kind of ideological state, I am sure there will be many difficulties in containing, in taking in different religious views, different religious approaches. But a soft Islamic superstructure or upper structure, if you like, can easily handle these matters. So personally, I think that a state should not have an ideology. A state should not be an ideological state, religious or otherwise. Because as long as you have an ideological state, that means that some people will interpret the ideology, religious or otherwise, and they will try to apply that ideology. And I am sure there will be many people who would interpret that ideology or that religion in a different way. And if state takes side with one of them, I am sure there will be many conflicts, many difficulties. So I think in a narrowly defined ideological sense, an Islamic state might have serious difficulties. As your question concerning Turkey, of course, Alawites are Muslims. They consider themselves as Muslims. They identify themselves as Muslims. So the difficulties are mainly about social issues, about political issues, about other issues, which really come in a way, the way you put your first question. I'm glad that you used the word inspired. Yes. By religion, inspired by Islam, you said, because inspiration is there. But that doesn't mean that all these movements are determined by Islam, or they are necessarily Islamic in the total sense of the term. There are many things included within these movements. Some of them are strongly, heavily social. Some of them are heavily political, but they have religion there. Whether calling them Islamic is a sociological fact or a political fact is another question. But I think in the Muslim countries we do not really have many problems as far as intra-Islamic diversities are concerned, because we are accustomed to having diversity in religious sense. We have more than 100 theological schools. We have more than 20 schools of law. We have more than 4 or 5 schools of philosophy. Turkish history and of course, Islamic heritage and tradition are really familiar with all types of diversities, including some mild form atheism or
But
some of irreligious forms.
Is it possible, Professor Kettani, that such forms of religious diversities within Islam would be respected on an equal footing by the state from an Islamic perspective?
Let's put it this way. Every Muslim movement is struggling toward establishing an Islamic society. This is a fact. In other words, what is the Islamic society? Let's ask the question. What is the ideal Islamic society for any Muslim movement? You pick up anyone. Obviously, the ideal Islamic society is not necessarily the Ottoman Empire or the Umayyad Empire or the Abbasid Empire. The ideal Islamic society is the one established by the Prophet ﷺ in Medina Munawwara. What type of society the Prophet ﷺ established in Medina Munawwara? We see that the first constitution established anywhere in the world is the one established by the Prophet ﷺ, and it's very liberal and very pluralistic. In the Islamic state of Medina Munawwara, the Prophet ﷺ accepted as equal citizens non-Muslim as well, both Jews and the atheistic. They were not Christians in Medina, but they were idolaters, Arab tribes. And there was a pact that as citizens they will fight together to defend the peace in their city. And this is the ideal Muslim. In other words, and traditionally even in Muslim history, we see that a Muslim society, and the state comes with it, because if the society chooses in a democratic system, and I don't see anything more democratic than an Islamic society, because it is based on Shura principles, and it's obvious. Democratic word is a word that is more modern. In Islamic society, in this sense, there is a lot of respect for the different view, for the religious minorities, linguistic minorities, and so forth and so on. And the fact is that religious minorities survived in all Muslim societies across Muslim history, and they didn't survive in other societies. The way how the right of the non-Muslim minorities, different views within the Muslim society, linguistically and so forth and so on, how it will be expressed is a matter of ijtihad. I think that these are the problems that should be solved within the thought, Islamic thought. What really the young people nowadays, and most of the thinkers, more and more of them, reject on what's going on in Muslim countries today, is that we Muslims stop thinking and keep on copying the way we have been doing for the last century or two.
But I don't think that you could say this, for example, about Professor Hassan or Professor Hanafi, as I know that what they are doing is exactly the thing you are pleading, that is to go away from copying the past. And therefore, I would like to ask you, Professor Hanafi, do you agree with what Professor Kettani just said about the ideal society of Medina? And I recall the work of Ali Abdarazik, who said that Muslims are completely free to choose whatever state system they would prefer in their own time.
Ali Abdul Razik was that time trying to copy the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk revolution in Egypt, and which is a secularism. But indeed, what Ali Kettani said is absolutely true. The Covenant of Medina was really a social contract between several communities. Everyone has the right, customs, language, religion, and so on, and enter in a certain kind of a peaceful pact with other community. All this is what we call the Islamic Ummah. Then pluralism is within Islamic society. But let me just tell you, usually it is really unfair to characterize Islam under this word, quote-unquote, religion, because if you open any dictionary in the West about religion, what you will find? You will find power, mystery, institution, dogma, rituals, and this does not fit to the spirit of Islam, which is essentially based on reason, on nature, on human rights, social justice, what you call the ideals of the Enlightenment in the 18th century Europe. This is what really touched more the spirit of Islam and the essence of Islam. That's why if you say Islam and modernism, as if Islam is not modern and modernism is coming from the West, Islam and the state, as if there is no politics in Islam, give to Caesar what to Caesar and give to God what is to God, and then state is something peculiar. No, Islam is a set of ideas, more or less like an ideology. It has a political theory, which is the common property of the masses and the social justice and labor as source of value. It has a political theory on the social contract, because the ruler in the Muslim Ummah is elected freely by the masses. He is not a clergy, he is not an ayatollah, he is not a representative of God, he is a representative of the masses, committing himself to the mass interest and the public welfare, and if he disobeys, he should be ousted by a certain kind of rules. It has a moral system, a legal system, and so on. And finally, really, Islam is the most pluralistic religion I have ever saw. Even before William James writing A Pluralistic Universe, different schools of law, of thought, the right to differ is absolutely a legal right. The Quran is saying that God created us differently. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. We have created you different tribes and peoples in order to know each other. And then, not only the right to defend my own freedom, because this is a little bit individualistic concept of freedom, but the right that others differ with me and I would respect their view. Then differences for convergences, we lost this pluralism maybe 1,000 years ago for certain kind of historical circumstances when Al-Ghazali came in the 5th century Hijrah, that means 12th century AD, and he found that the Abbasid Empire is so weak, then he wanted to make the strong state with one idea, with one dogma. Ash'arism, Shafi'ism, criticizing the all opposition groups, the Batinides, the Kharijites, the Mu'tazilites. He was thinking that a strong state with one idea would be more viable than pluralism. And till now, 1,000 years, we are still under unilateralism. Then, if we can, since the last 200 years, we are trying to recuperate our pluralism again, different schools of theology, of thought, of philosophy, in order that this pluralism, the right to differ, would be pluralism on the theoretical level, but does not prevent us from making a socio-political agenda on the practical level, as the Usuliyun have also said.
The fundamentalist, you want to say?
Yes.
Usuliyun.
No,
or are you referring to the specialists
one
in the sources of Islamic law
exactly.
and theology?
The jurists, the jurisprudence,
Yes.
they are saying that when they ask the question, is the truth one or many? Then they answer, the theoretical truth is many. That means man can judge according to different frame of references, but the practical truth is one, which is the implementation of the public welfare. Then here really, you can be a Marxist, a nationalist, a Mu'tazilite, a Kharijite, but what we want is really the implementation of freedom and social justice, the two major objectives of the Muslim world.
You have given a warm pleading for pluralism, but you have, I think, forgotten one very important kind of pluralism, and that is the pluralism of men and women. And I should like to address now Professor Hassan, whether she, from her expertise in the field of the study of women in Islam, would agree to the view of Professor Hanafi concerning pluralism and social justice as it is prescribed and inspired by Islam.
I think that whatever Professor Hanafi has said is correct given the background of Islamic thought and history. What I would, since you have addressed to me specifically the question of women, let me say that women have, in a sense, been victims of history in the case of all of the major religions of the world, including Islam, which happens to be the youngest of these religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. That in a sense what has happened is that these religions developed within cultures that were largely patriarchal, and women were excluded from religious learning, from the interpretation of the sources of these traditions, with the result that what came to be known as the Islamic tradition, as also the other traditions, was very patriarchal in its orientation. And this led to a lot of injustices. And I feel that, the struggle in which I have been involved in terms of both my own life as well as my work is precisely the recovering of that element of justice that Dr. Kettani and Dr. Hanafi have been talking about. I think that, one of the constant themes of the Quran from Surah 1 to Surah 114 is social justice, that this is a categorical imperative. It has to be implemented. And so the approach that I follow in my work is that I point out the discrepancy between Quranic ideals and Muslim realities insofar as women are concerned, and point out the necessity that if one is indeed faithful to Islam, one has to implement the justice which is enshrined in the Quranic teachings with regards to women. And I think the Quran gives to women enormous rights. I think that, it's very concerned about women's rights. But these rights are not to be found in many Muslim societies, unfortunately. And that's where the struggle is to make the reality conform to the ideals. So I think that we are, all of us, basically sort of coming at it from the same point of view. We're not talking about the same questions, but I think our concerns are very similar.
And could you illustrate this with one single example? Mm-hmm. I mean, the struggle for women's rights inspired by the justice to be found in the Quran.
All right. Let me start at the practical end of it. There is the so-called process of Islamization that is going on in many countries. I come from Pakistan, and this process was initiated in Pakistan in the 1970s by General Muhammad Ziaul Haq, who was a military ruler. And many laws were imposed. For instance, in 1979, the Hudud Ordinance was promulgated, according to which in all the Had crimes, which are the most serious crimes, the evidence that is admissible is that of four men, instead of there being of four believers. Which means that in a Had crime such as that of rape, a woman's evidence, a woman, if she's raped, her own evidence is not admissible, which obviously is very unjust situation. And in fact, one of the major motivations of the feminist movement in Pakistan was the rape of a girl who was near blind by her master. She worked in a domestic situation in a family, and she was raped by her master and his son, and so on. And as a result of this gang rape, she became pregnant. Her case was tried by the federal Shariat court, and she was sentenced to be stoned to death, which is absolutely ridiculous. First of all, stoning is not a Quranic punishment, but anyhow, that's another discussion. And furthermore, being blind or near blind, she couldn't identify her assailants. And so this was one of the major reasons why the feminist movement was born, to protest against it. But what has happened is that since then, other laws have been promulgated, like the Qanun-e-Shahadat, or Law of Evidence in 1984, and so on. And what is happening now is that in my work, for instance, is that I am taking a stand against these sorts of laws by going back to the Quran and saying this is against the Quranic teachings. And we can talk about it in terms of marriage, divorce, inheritance, I mean, name it. There are just so many fields in which the Quran has given definite rights that are not being implemented. And I think Muslim women have an enormously powerful tool, because no matter who you're talking about Islamicists, and I'm very happy that you're not using the typical Western word of fundamentalist, which is totally unacceptable. But the thing is that if I, who consider myself a Muslim, but I consider myself a progressive Muslim, a rational Muslim, if I were to have a discussion with any quote Islamicist or even so-called fundamentalist, I don't think that the fundamentalist can reject what I am saying simply out of hand, because my work, my theology is rooted in the Quran, and I can quote the Quran as well as he can, or as much as he can, or and so on. So I think that I have something to build my case on, which is, in other words, what I'm saying is that Islamic teachings have been used against women historically, but the core of justice, which is at the heart of the Quran, can also be used to liberate women. I think that, in fact, is the only way that women are going to be liberated, is within the framework of Islam, Quranic Islam.
Should we conclude then, Professor Hanafi, that also the contemporary political Islamist movements would in fact be able to promote the case of women emancipation?
As far as conservatism is still the major trend in Islam, they will not be able. As far as the 1,000 years which we have inherited from the past has more weight than the 400, 500 years of pluralism which we have lived before this, they will be unable. But sometimes the Islamic law concerning women and concerning also the penal code is used by the ruling elites as a mean to oppress the masses for social control. Militarism or kingdoms, in the case of Pakistan and the case of Egypt. But indeed, we need the courageous scholars and the jurists who would put the old Islamic law in context. Because Islam came, the women had no right to live. They would bury the female alive. And then the Quran would give her the right to live. They had no right to inherit. They gave the Quran here half inheritance. They had no right for witness, halfway. And this is the way of the Quran to make things gradually in order that social change may be implemented, because declaration of intent, it is very beautiful theoretically, but practically nothing will change. And the jurist has to understand the spirit of Islam. The spirit of Islam is towards quality. But where is the courageous jurist nowadays who would take the spirit of Islam towards equality and restructure the old law in order really to make Islam coping with modernity and answering the lot of grievances which we hear nowadays, not only from the West, but even within the Muslim world from Muslim women.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, dear professors, thank you very much for your contribution, pleading for pluralism, for modernity, for women's emancipation, but on the basis of the original and authentic sources of Islam. This is, in a few words, the conclusion of our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Volgende week kunt u kijken naar het tweede deel van de toekomst van de islam. Assalamu alaikum. Welkom bij de Nederlandse Moslimomroep. Ter afsluiting van onze serie Islam en Moderniteit kunt u nu kijken naar het tweede deel van de toekomst van de islam. De presentatie is in handen van de Leidse islamoloog Sjoerd van Koningsveld.
Well, I hope in the near future. Yes. Islam and the values of the modern age. Can they stimulate each other, notwithstanding obvious conflicts? We are living in a time of turmoil and rapid change. Changes in traditional family structures, changes in traditional ideas about Islam. How will Islam enter the 21st century? What is the future of Islam? Today, we have invited 4 prominent Muslim scholars of different backgrounds who will share with us their views on these and related other subjects. First of all, Professor Mehmed Iden, Dean of the Faculty of Theology in the University of Izmir, who is a specialist in religious philosophy and ethics, and has written a number of books and many articles in these fields, both in Turkish and also in English. Secondly, Professor Rifat Hassan, professor of religious studies in the University of Louisville, Kentucky, in the United States of America. Professor Hassan, who is of Pakistani background, is a renowned specialist in the study of the position of women in Islam and also in inter-religious dialogue. She wrote a number of books and articles in these fields. Thirdly, Professor Ali Kettani from Rabat, Morocco, who is the rector of the Ibn Rushd University in Cordoba, Spain. Professor Kettani has written a series of books and articles, both in Arabic and English, on the position of Muslim minorities outside the Muslim world and especially in the West. And last but not least, Professor Hassan Hanafi, who is the head of the Department of Philosophy of the University of Cairo and who is renowned internationally for a series of studies, both in Arabic and other language, in the fields of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, and especially about the relation between Islam and modernity. Professor Hanafi, we are witnessing today worldwide movements, political movements inspired by Islam, both peaceful and sometimes violent movements. Are these movements to stay? Will they have a lasting impact on Islam in the future, or will they disappear quickly?
As far as the actual historical circumstances exist, it will stay. A boy who is 18 years old, uneducated, unemployed, having no home. There are about 4 million Egyptians living in the city of the desert and in the thumbs around Cairo, the peripheric Cairo. From there, Islamic movements, young people are recruited. Then, if somebody comes and tell him, come and we'll make you the prince of the world and the future Messiah, then he would come if he does not want to go to drugs or migrate to the Gulf or to Canada and USA.
What you are saying is that as long as the socio-economic circumstances feeding these movements will endure, these movements will have a breeding ground and will last in the future as well. And is this true for Turkey and for other countries you know of in the Muslim world as well, Professor?
There are different movements, and these different movements are attached to religious ideals in different ways. Some of them are religious in orientation, in content, and in direction. Some of them have little to do with religion, and perhaps some of them are misusing religions for political purposes, for other purposes as well. So in reality, in fact, there are different movements, and different movements have many things in common, but they have some other things which are sometimes contrary to each other. And the second thing is that, for example, in Turkey, we do not really, luckily and happily, we do not have violent movements which identify themselves as Islamic movements, because I think something can be terribly wrong if one tries to justify one's political action in terms, violent political actions, in terms of the Quran, in terms of religion, in terms of Islam, unless there is a self-defense, unless there is oppression that can only be got rid of through some form of violence, which is really very difficult again to try to give any justification. But as far as our experience in Turkey is concerned, luckily we do not have such movements.
Is then the socio-economic background, is that the only basis for such movement, or is there a broader, perhaps, political awareness, a longing for social justice, which has a broad basis in many parts of the world, which really explains also these movements and explains their vitality, Professor Kettani?
Yeah, I don't feel at ease with what I heard now, because it gives me the impression that Islamic movement comes as a reaction of ignorance or poverty, etc. This is not the case. Really, there is a crisis in the Muslim world. It's a fact. Muslim world entered the 20th century in a very bad shape, colonized practically entirely. And then there was Islam and other ideologies that entered in, like nationalism and so forth and so on, Arab nationalism, Turkish nationalism and so forth and so on, that promised communism, etc., that promised to improve the lot of the people. By 1970s, 80s, they all failed. Now, whether it's my view, this is the truth or not, but this is the point of view of the masses of the Muslims. Therefore, Islam came in and took, again, its right place that it had always had in the past or in the Muslim nations, to try to find solution to real problems. Now, it is not, I mean, those who are more or less, now let's say, Islamists are moving, first of all, they try their ground. There are different movements, different types, and so forth and so on. They try. It doesn't mean that they are not Islamic or anything. There is a diversity of Islamic movements. It's normal. You cannot put all of them in the same package. But they are trying their way. There is a Muslim Islamic mouvance, if I can use a French word for it. The other thing that we should be aware of is it's really wrong and it's not true to link up violence with Islamic movements.
But the reality shows us in some cases that violence is used in the name of Islam.
Let me qualify what I'm saying. When there is a violent situation, Islamic movement become violent. I will explain that. When there is no violent situation, Islamic movements are not violent. Islamic movements are not violent in Morocco because there is no violent situation. There is violence in Algeria because the state has made the violence, because when you have elections and 80% of the people choose a party and then you come and you have a coup d'etat, and this is a violent situation. So there is a violence of the state and of the people of Algeria in the name of Islam. Otherwise they would have been violent anyway, in any name under such circumstances.
This is
so
clear, your point is clear, but allow me to ask Professor Hassan, what is then the lasting meaning of this Islamic revival if we look at the future of Islam? What is the kernel of these movements which has a lasting impact on the future?
First of all, let me say this, that I think that there is a great reluctance on the part of many analysts, especially people with a social scientific orientation, to recognize Islam as being a very vital part of the Muslim world. When a problem is being analyzed, people would like to analyze it in terms of economics, in terms of politics, etc., but not in terms of Islam. Or even if they are willing to give Islam a place, they regard Islam as one of the elements that is involved in understanding a certain situation. And my view of this situation is very different. I don't think that Islam is simply one of the elements that has to be understood. I think Islam is the matrix in which the lives of Muslims are rooted. I think it's the ground in which they live. And I think without understanding the importance of Islam, it is totally impossible for anybody, particularly anybody in the West, to understand what is happening in the Islamic world. So I think that this whole the understanding of Islam and the role that Islam is playing in Muslim life, in Islamic movements, is very vital. And this is something that is definitely going to stay. And I think, therefore, it must be understood, because the dangers of not understanding the role of Islam in the lives of Muslims and in the life of the world are going to be, totally beyond comprehension.
This is what we're trying to do just now during this discussion.
Right.
And of course, we still, I believe, have not yet grasped fully this kernel of these movements, which will perhaps make a major contribution in entering a new era in the period, in the history of Islam. Could you try again, Professor Hanafi, to say something about this?
If the Muslim world is successful, then Islam is a big component of a whole project like the process of decolonization in Morocco, in Algeria, in Egypt, in Sudan, everywhere. But when the project fades and falls down, like nowadays, after especially the defeat of '67, then Islam comes as a vehicle of protest, social protest, political protest. And Muslims learn in their past that they were really masters of the universe. Now, the present is very critical, the future is very gloomy, and then they react angrily I call it sometimes the angry Islam as a social protest, since other social protest movements, secular ideologies of modernization are too weak. Liberals, nationalists, Marxists, then Islam as the big traditional popular movement comes as a carrier of a protest, rightly, especially Chechnya, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iraq blockade, the Libya blockade, and then the Muslims would react against external forces and internal forces.
I mean, you are perhaps unwillingly reducing these movements to the aspect of protest, but isn't it true that even behind this aspect, we are really facing a new generation of people who no longer can accept to be excluded from political life in general, who want to be heard and to participate in a democratical context, and that this is the real meaning of what is going on?
May I add a few sentences? To begin with, this political aspect is not as important as it appears from the first sight. Revivalism exists in religious education, in the field of faith, commitment, sacrifice, in the field of worship, and in establishing schools and running hospitals, in many other fields. So revivalism is not just something political,
of course,
but the political aspect of it, or those who are politically oriented, are really drawing much attention, especially from the West, and then of course through that influence in the Muslim world as well. So it is a universal phenomena. For example, in tariqas, in Sufi orders, there is a great revivalism, and Sufi movements are not usually political.
And we should not forget that there is revivalism in other religions as well.
As well, in spirituality,
in Christianity, in Judaism, and we could refer to Hinduism as well. So we are really dealing with a universal phenomenon.
Yes, universal, and this will last, especially in the Muslim world, because it is the question of identity, it is the question of eschatology. People are worrying about the world to come, about Jannah, Jahannam, and so on and so forth. They are very important. But unfortunately, all of them are, in a way, forgotten. Well, not forgotten, but in a way pushed to the background, and then the political side comes.
The problem here, really, in the Muslim world, we have really a conflict situation. Let's put it. This is what worries me. Here you have a rising force, which is Islam thinking. It's a fact. This is where the young people go. That means it's a force of the future more than the present. Yet this force really is facing the real problems that are faced by the Muslim world. Facing dictatorships that are widespread in Muslim countries. Facing corruption widespread in Muslim countries. Facing lack of jobs. That's it. Social work. A lot of these groups do social work that the states are not doing.
Yes.
Do the education work that the states are not doing. The state really, most of the services of a state in general has to do in Muslim countries. They are not doing that. Yet these forces are rejected by the government of the Muslim countries and by the West that is supporting these governments. And this is the, I think if we are going to have a better future, the West has to be more rational. If there is a force there, you have to deal with it. In other words, Islam is here to live and is here to be stronger in the 21st century, not only in the Muslim countries, in the whole world, because this revival is all over the world going on. So let us sit with the Muslim thinkers, leaders, etc., representatives of this movement, whatever. Let's discuss with them. What do they think? Are they really extremists? Are they violent? Are they crazy? Are they something? Maybe we will discover that 90% of their ideas we can share with. Maybe we can build with them a better world. I mean, this idea of exclusivism, of keeping people out, is the one that leads to violence.
Okay, let us start right away to check your proposal. And I would like to ask Professor Hassan, what would be the consequence of the practical application of the proposal of Kettani for the position of women in Islam? Would that be a favorable influence?
I would say that, you know, my colleagues here have emphasized a lot of other things that Islam is a symbol of in the contemporary world. But I don't think that they have put enough emphasis on what I would consider to be the central part of it, which is the idea of justice, that justice must be secured, whether it is the justice of, one depressed economic class against another, or people who are politically deprived, etc. Because I think that the greatest injustice that is being perpetrated in the Islamic world is the injustice that's being done to women. And that even people who consider themselves very progressive, Muslims who consider themselves very progressive and liberal, attach a very low priority to the whole issue of women. It's sort of like saying, well, let's liberate our countries first, let's have, democracy first, and then we'll talk about women. But you can't have liberation first, and you can't have democracy first until the rights of women are recognized.
You believe that the case of women and the case of democracy are interrelated very tightly?
Absolutely, because women are one half of the Islamic Ummah, and if women are going to be excluded from the process, then there is not going to be any democracy, and there isn't going to be any liberation. And I feel that this is the largest sociological question that the Islamic world is being confronted by, which it isn't really dealing with in a satisfactory manner. At the same time, unfortunately, what is happening is that the question of Muslim women has been politicized by the West. There's a lot of lip sympathy being paid to the poor, oppressed Muslim woman by the West. But I doubt very much that whether this sympathy is real or not. I think that this question, the West is using the question of Muslim women to hit the Muslims with, to show how backward the Muslims are. Look at the Muslims, how badly they treat the women. But when Muslim women are being burned, Turkish girls were burned in Germany, what did the West do? Nothing. When Muslim women are raped in Bosnia, what did the Western world do? Nothing. I mean, the sympathy isn't real. But the question has been politicized, just as the question of hijab or veiling has been politicized. These are very complicated questions, which we can't talk about in a minute or two. But I think we need to, I would like to emphasize, first of all, how important the question of women is, and that this question isn't being taken seriously, either within the Islamic world or in the West.
The rights of women, can be secured in many ways, and Western way, Western style is one of them. So there are many ways of connecting one thing with another, connecting religion with state, connecting certain rights with other rights. But may I say that in many cases, I think our view of women is quite traditional. That is the impression that I have. In other words, they may be in the foreground.